Hello everyone. So for this video I want to talk about the economics of discrimination, and I'm going to put a heavy emphasis on historical discrimination and how the effects of historical discrimination propagate into the present day. And I'm going to close with a kind of more broad discussion about property rights that I hope you find kind of interesting. So I'm going to start with some background along with some of the theoretical approaches to the economics discrimination, because this is kind of still the guiding theoretical background of a lot of the empirical research of today. I'm going to talk about redlining, which we kind of think of maybe as a more historical practice, but it has very real implications today and maybe is still happening in some ways, but we'll get into that in more detail. And then finally, the closing discussion on property rights that I spoke about. So, just some background. This Kenneth Arrow quote kind of puts forward the fact that it really didn't require subtle economic analysis to determine if discrimination was present and in what forms, when it was just the law of the land. It was there on the face of it. But now it happens in ways that are somewhat more subtle because they aren't codified in law. They happen through individual biases and systemic kind of failures. And that requires much more subtle economic analysis and is much more difficult to kind of deal with. We're going to limit ourselves kind of mostly to economic discrimination for this discussion, because if we were talking about this more broadly, like it's a whole class on the economics of race, class, and gender, and we don't have time for that here. But I would like you to think about, at least in the economic sphere, we're talking about discrimination in labor markets, so the incomes that people can generate through selling their labor, credit markets, access to money to invest, and finally, in markets for goods and services. For our discussion here, we're going to mostly focus on labor markets and credit markets. So this graph here shows earnings for different gender, race permutations in 2017 and 2018. In both years, the average earnings of white males are indexed to be 100. So we can see here that in uncontrolled terms, so these are not controlling for different characteristics. So just in pure uncontrolled terms, white women make about 81% of what males make. Black males somewhat lower at around 75-ish. Black females even below that. Similar numbers for Hispanic males and females. Over on the right-hand side there, you can see that Asian males make more than white males, and Asian females make only slightly less than white males. It is important to note in that last category, Asian male and Asian female, there's a great deal of heterogeneity in those groups based on national origin. So, for instance, Chinese immigrants do tend to earn very high. Japanese immigrants tend to make very high. But people from racial minorities in Southeast Asia tend to actually be quite discriminated against and make much lower than that amount. So just something to keep in mind, that these are all statistical aggregates. Pointing towards the gender earnings ratio that we could see a bit in that last slide, we've got averages of periods from 1979 to 1988, 1989, 1998, and so on. And so the numbers at the top of each column represent the percentage point change in median weekly gender earnings ratio over that period. And so we can see that 7.9% of that ratio was obliterated in 79 to 88, but in subsequent decades, the progress has slowed to where in the 09 to 2018 period, not even a percentage point fall came about when it came to the gender earnings ratio. So one way to put that in context is that progress is still occurring, but it is happening at a slower rate as time goes on. So women who are also a member of a historically discriminated against racial minority are hit worse of all. If we go back to that slide, we can see that black females and Hispanic females are the lowest earning group demographically. There are a lot of factors that contribute to the gender wage gap in particular. Lack of paid family leave, both for men and women, because it makes firms have different decision making relative to men and women. That's a whole further discussion. Because we do find that in nations where men are offered paternity leave and do utilize it, that there is actually less gender discrimination in the workplace in terms of pay. That's a whole thing. Lack of subsidized childcare, because for various historical and social reasons, women have taken on a much larger share of the unpaid household work, and so lack of subsidized childcare hits them far worse than it hits men. And there's also just outright discrimination in compensation and hiring. So this is where we get into some empirical difficulties about controlling for other factors, because some economists argue that women are paid less because they choose to pursue less high-paying professions. I think that it is also, kind of as a counterpoint to that, important to think about why are these professions lower paying? Are these professions lower paying because they're less productive, or are they lower paying because women tend to pick them and discrimination is occurring? And just like we spoke about earlier in the course with measurement, is it right and proper to control for occupational choice or educational attainment and all of those things if occupational choice and educational attainment are consequences of discrimination, right? So if women are being crowded into these professions, or if, for instance, also, black people are being crowded in or out of certain professions, occupational choice may not make that much sense to control for if we're trying to detect the consequences or the effects of discrimination. To put the gender pay gap into perspective here, if women were paid the same as men with comparable productive characteristics, so this would be controlling for those things like educational attainment, tenure, things like that, nearly 60% of women workers would experience a pay increase as a result, and the poverty rate among women would be halved. So another thing to kind of put this in perspective empirically is the median African American household, so the household at the 50th percentile of income among African American households is only 35th percentile if we look at all households in the U.S. in general. So as overall inequality increases, that point will also move kind of lower in the percentile. So it's getting worse in that respect. So turning our attention to the Stiglitz paper I had you look at, my main reason for putting this forward is I wanted you to see maybe some of the less contextual understanding that many economists have of discrimination. For many economists, they do not engage with the historical realities of discrimination. It is merely a abstract thing that happens in mathematical models. Now, there are many very good economists that use the approaches of Stiglitz that are aware of that history, but these approaches that Stiglitz highlights are still the theoretical backing of what most economists of race, class, and gender do. And I would keep it, I want to definitely highlight here that Stiglitz is very intentional in keeping things very abstract. He has the U and D groups, the undiscriminated group and the discriminated group, right? It's so ahistorical in that way. He talks about 3 different ways that discrimination occurs in labor markets: wage discrimination, occupational crowding, and discrimination in hiring. And so his basic question is, under what circumstances is it possible for groups with identical characteristics to receive different wages in market equilibrium? So it is still couched in this idea that markets will reach some equilibrium. How are we seeing discrimination there? Because all of these theories work from the premises that if markets are competitive, then somebody can enter the market and make a higher rate of return and outcompete the others by not discriminating if discrimination exists in the market. And so at this stage of theory development, it's just trying to determine why this conundrum of economic discrimination occurs in reality, despite the fact theory says it should not. So these are kind of the 4 ways that Stiglitz is able to explain the existence of discrimination in markets. One is discriminatory preferences, market imperfections, statistical discrimination, and then finally differential information. So let's start with the first one there, discriminatory preference. So the idea here is that agents have a preference to work with members of the same group, and they will accept lower pay to fulfill this preference. That should say wage. Market competition will lead to wage ratio equalization in most cases. So this is once again attaching itself to the idea that market competition will drive out workers that have this discriminatory preference, because other workers could come in and make a higher wage rate if they lack that preference. And so this is one way that Stiglitz arrives at occupational crowding. We could also think about this in output markets. The classic historical example here is if you've got a business in the South during Jim Crow, that business may fail if it decides unilaterally to not discriminate, because they will then lose all of their white customers, right? And so in that way, the discriminatory preference is not of workers and not of employers, but of consumers, reinforces discrimination. So I think the more subtle story in Stiglitz here is the idea of market failure. So the idea here is that if there's some labor market power, if one group is excluded from union membership, say, their wages will be reduced. Yet we can still see wage differentials even in non-unionized sectors. So it can't be fully laid at this kind of exclusion of unions. There could also be disequilibrium in labor markets. So firms with more applicants than jobs can, without cost, act on some discriminatory preference because there's kind of a queue of workers. And so this circumstance could be created in equilibrium by binding efficiency or minimum wage. So efficiency wages being where firms pay higher than the marginal productivity of workers to increase the cost of job loss. And minimum wages we know exist in reality, and efficiency wages also have been detected in many circumstances. So in either case, anytime an employer pays above the competitive market equilibrium wage, discriminatory preferences can be costlessly acted upon by the employer because there's a queue of workers. A final point that Stiglitz brings up under market failure is disequilibrium in housing and transportation markets. So inefficient operation of these markets can limit access to better jobs. On the face of it, it's a throwaway short section in the paper, but this is perhaps somewhat convincing, especially given what we'll talk about here in a bit, redlining, which limited the ability of African Americans in the U.S. to live in specific neighborhoods due to denial of access to credit. Another explanation that Stiglitz gives is statistical discrimination. So the idea here is that firms don't know the productivity of each applicant perfectly, but they know the average productivity of members of certain groups. So firms may statistically discriminate against members of groups with lower than average productivity. And then he goes into this extended discussion about turnover rates as one measure of productivity. I don't think that is a particularly important aspect of it. But this argument is different than all of the other arguments that Stiglitz is making here. Because statistical discrimination, unlike discriminatory preferences or market failures, is, in pure theory terms, economically efficient. And I think that this kind of opens up a window into it to think about, to ask questions that economists don't often ask of. Why would the average productivity of one group possibly be lower than the other? Is it because they've been denied access to human capital attainment? Which has clearly been the case historically in the US for some groups, right? So it's always important to keep in mind. And to kind of step beyond the pure economic theory to think about reality a bit more. And the final one, which I find a less compelling story, is information. And that is that applicants don't look at the wage rates that all firms are offering. They take a random sampling of firms to determine what the wage is going to be. And part of the way they do this is by talking to people that they have social networks with. So this knowledge about the pay rate of firms is shared within networks, but not between different networks. So wage differentials could arise through pure chance, which I think is not an especially compelling explanation for economic discrimination. So the old papers that Stiglitz is talking about here still get cited anytime somebody writes about discrimination today. These are still very prominent touchstones in the economics profession, for good or for ill. Just like labor economics as a whole, discrimination research has become far more empirical, so a lot more work is being done actually looking at the real world rather than making theoretical models that explain why discrimination may hold in this kind of abstract way. But importantly, most of these papers are based in one of these theoretical approaches that Stiglitz talked about. So they're trying to explain discrimination by using that theoretical thing and detecting in the real world using regression analysis. Along these lines, empirical detection of differential treatment is not hard to find, but measuring its magnitude is. And one reason that it is difficult is because it's not an objective decision to decide what should be included as control variables. Should we control for occupational choice? Should we control for educational attainment? And these are kind of sticky questions. And there are some kind of common things that are controlled for, but these control variables may not always be available in a given data set. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. Another approach that has been done is field experiments. So you may have heard of some of these where they'll put out bogus job applications with white-sounding names or black-sounding names or Hispanic-sounding names, and they'll use that to measure differential treatment in hiring. And we do find that these field experiments, more often than not, find discriminatory hiring practices to exist. So I'm going to turn the discussion here from that very kind of abstract theoretical stuff that Stiglitz was talking about to something very concrete and historical, and that is redlining. So redlining was a practice of refusing loans or insurance to someone because they lived in an area deemed to be a poor financial risk. So that's kind of formal definition. But this usually fell along racial lines, often explicitly. So what I have here is a map of Salt Lake City. If you click the link on this week's page at Mapping and Equality, you should be able to look at it as well. And each section that you can click on will tell you what the comments of the official, the government official whose job was to deem the credit risk for a specific area. You can see what their comments were. And it is striking to read those comments. It's clear from reading those comments that it's not simply that, Black and Hispanic people tended to live in areas that were poor credit risks. No. The comments of these assessors state the presence of black people and Hispanic folks as the reason for an area being the bad credit risk. And so, whether, true or false, the assessment of these officials made it far more difficult for people living in these areas to gain credit. So, and it also reduces housing values, because if fewer people can get credit to buy houses in a specific area, that artificially reduces the demand for housing in that area, which reduces the price for the houses that are already existent in that area. So the consequence of this was a systemic denial of access to credit to African Americans and other minority groups in the U.S., which led to a great deal of geographic crowding. And because, at least in the U.S., and I think also in various other parts of the world, a huge amount of individual and familial wealth is built up in housing, the systemic denial of credit severely curtailed the ability of African American households to accumulate wealth. The practice of redlining was formally ended by the Federal Housing Administration in 1968. However, contemporary mortgage risk assessments still continue and have similar effects today because of historical developments, right? So you've got these areas that have received a low degree of investment in housing because of historical denial of credit back in, the 60s, 50s, 40s. And moving forward, this lower level of investment due to these discriminatory federal policies has led those areas to be a worse and worse credit risk moving into the future. So we've kind of got two degrees of path dependence here. We've got the path dependence that systemic denial of access to credit led to lower wealth accumulation, which then leads to lower inheritances in the future and less wealth for all African Americans affected by this policy moving forward. But we also have the idea that we also have the path dependence that African Americans were crowded into specific areas due to these policies, and those policies also reduced housing investment through denial of credit, making them poorer credit risks in the future. So despite the fact that contemporary mortgage risk assessments may not have race as a determining factor in their kind of equation that spits out whether they grant a loan or not, it does still tend to fall along racial lines. This is often stated in terms of algorithmic discrimination. It's kind of mechanistic, but it's still discriminatory. So, we can't attribute the entirety of this to redlining, and there are innumerable historical consequences that have kind of led to African American households having less wealth than white households. But just pure empirics here. On average, white families have 10 times more net worth than black families. 10 times more. And 8 times more than Hispanic families. And so these groups are crowded, have been historically crowded into specific areas, and formerly redlined communities still tend to be lower income today. This also kind of brings up the issue of gentrification, where incomes may increase in these formerly redlined communities, but existing residents could be forced out. And we'll talk about that more whenever we talk about housing as a specific issue. So let's wrap this up by talking about property rights. So what I hope this discussion of redlining has impressed on you is that African Americans were systemically denied, and other groups like Hispanics were also systemically denied access to the means to obtain wealth in the past. And we think about rule of law and enforcement of property rights as being kind of a baseline policy that's neutral to different groups. And economists tend to place a great deal of emphasis on the importance of property rights and property rights enforcement. But something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is if an entire subgroup of a population is denied access to property, does enforcement of property rights become discriminatory in and of itself? And that's a question that I think I'm still grappling with. And I'm hoping that maybe you'll grapple with it too now. But I think it's very difficult to make an argument that legal enforcement of property rights is something that's neutral whenever huge numbers of people have been denied the means to get access to property. And thinking more broadly here, we can also think about, the obvious historical denial of some groups access to human capital attainment and social capital, even more broadly. And so I think that this kind of critical examination of property rights in the face of racial discrimination also highlights the necessity of further critical analysis of other social structures that kind of determine the productivity of individuals. So I think that we should, as economists, not fall into the trap of thinking about people as coming to the market with certain endowments, but they're equal in the market. We should think about the ways in which the market is unequal, but importantly, we should think about the endowments that people come to the market with and where those come from. And in large part, those things are determined by history and historical policy. So, just to wrap up this talk, discrimination happens in a bunch of different economic contexts: product, labor, and credit markets. Wage discrimination against women and racial minorities is prevalent, but it's difficult to measure and difficult to decide what are the important control variables. Economists still view labor market discrimination as a consequence of market imperfection, incomplete information, and individual choice, for good or for ill. And finally, limited access to credit and other legal rights has immense negative effects on the wealth of African Americans, and those effects kind of propagate into the present day. So I think that's all I've got for today. I hope that this kind of got you to look at economic discrimination maybe in some different ways than you have in the past. And next talk is going to be about market power. So that's all I got. Thanks.